cancelling that, sometimes it's not recording.
No, I think we're good. Yeah, if not, this is always in my way, but okay, cool. So, whoops. Hi, I'm Philipp. I'm also part of the community team, but let's see what we can actually do. So, ransomware attacks or security in Elasticsearch has been a fun topic. Has anybody been personally affected? If you don't want to admit it, we can talk about it privately afterwards. But it is a hot topic. I think we ourselves every now and then have some testing server somewhere open that gets accidentally ransomed. But I just picked 3 cases from the last month, and I think every 1 or 2 weeks there is something like that, where the news say like unsecured Elasticsearch data replaced with ransom nodes, and then they ask for bitcoins if they're still worth anything today. Or in Norway they had a big breach of, I think, homeowners. There was another case where large amounts of data, of user data, were publicly accessible, and that's just like from the last month. And I think the important part that we always like to point out is like these are all misconfigured servers. So it's not a problem in the cloud service. It's not a problem in the software itself. These were all misconfigured services of our software. But we need to make it a bit easier to actually avoid those problems. And that's what I wanted to dive into. So just a quick look of security over time in Elastic. So those who are very old and have been around for almost forever, does anybody still remember when 2.0 came out?
No, I didn't use it by then anymore.
Yeah, you shouldn't use that version anymore. I think it was 2015 or so when 2.0 came out, so that was a long time ago. And before that, Elasticsearch was always binding to all interfaces, which was great for demos. And I had the great fun when I was doing training classes back then, that you would start one Elasticsearch node and then your neighbor would start another Elasticsearch node, and they would also broadcast on the local network and would form one large cluster. And then one attendee was writing some data, and then the attendee next to them was deleting the data. And then it was always like hilarity that it's a big cluster and then random stuff happens. And it was great for demos or for the fun, but it wasn't so much fun for production use cases. It was especially bad if you would VPN to your production server, and then your local installation would form a cluster with your production server, and then you think you do a delete locally and then delete data, and then don't do stuff like that, or use a proper Elasticsearch name or a proper cluster name for Elasticsearch, because it will always only cluster if it uses the same server name or Elasticsearch name. But most people don't do that, so it was a good change to actually only bind to local hosts since then. And that's basically the first line of defense, and everybody who gets ransomed out there, it's not to blame them, but everybody started with that thing, or Elasticsearch that only bound to localhost, and then they changed it to listen on all interfaces without adding any other security features, and that's normally how you get ransomed. So that's the first step. But it wasn't enough, so we have been improving and adding things for security over time. In 6.0, we removed the default password. Does anybody still remember what the default password was?
Change me.
Change me. Did anybody ever change me?
No.
Which was the next problem. So change me was not a very good idea, and that's why we got rid of that a long time ago as well. Then we added free security in 6.8 and 7.1, so that was a long time ago. So any version that is still supported by us today has free security built in, and everybody should ideally use that. The big driver back then was that before we were always saying like, well, you can only bind to localhost, or you can run or use a firewall, or you can run a reverse proxy to protect your cluster, like Nginx that would terminate TLS and have basic auth. What changed? Why did we suddenly change our mind? The headlines? Yeah, the headlines. I think the headlines we were kind of resistant to by then, but the thing that we brought out was the Kubernetes operator. And with Kubernetes networking, you suddenly cannot just that easily run a reverse proxy or a firewall in front of your service. And these versions are not accidentally the same, but free security and that the operator came out at the same version were intentional. So the Kubernetes operator has always enforced security for you. So when you start the operator, it automatically, since it's code, like written in Go code, it will do the right thing for you. So it will automatically generate random passwords for you. It will generate the TLS certificates and configure all of those together. So if you use the operator, you can not run without security. It's one of the settings where the operator, that it doesn't really let you override that. So you cannot turn off security. What you could do for those who are using more Kubernetes on the HTTP port, you could disable TLS, so you could have that as a centralized thing that if you manage your certificates elsewhere. But within the cluster on the transport protocol and for security in general, that is always enforced inside the cluster. Anybody using the operator? Okay, I assume you're running with security then. Yes, good. And in 8.0 now, earlier this year, we actually enabled security by default. So it took us some time, but it's not exactly the same approach that the operator is doing. But what we are doing now is that when a cluster starts, it will generate random passwords for you, and it will generate the TLS certificates for you as well. Unless you turn it off, which you really shouldn't do. Some people still do and complain that it's too much work or too complicated. But actually, security is not that much work anymore in 8.0. Let me quickly show you how. I just wanted to mention two gotchas before we do that. Configure one, configure all. Did anybody experience that? If you configure any security setting in Elasticsearch, you need to configure everything. So even if you just say configure security true, where you, even though it's the default value, if you override the default value, you would then need to configure like where are the TLS certificates and everything located. We actually, when we did some internal documentation, we ran into that as soon as you override a single setting, you need to make sure you have all the right settings in security, which is a bit of a gotcha, but the security team was like, well, you configured something that is not the default, so obviously you want something different, and then you will need to take care of it yourself. That's a bit of a gotcha. The other thing is, if you upgrade from an earlier version, if you disable security, you need to manually configure everything still. So only if you run with security that generates it when the cluster starts up, it will do everything automatically for you. If you tell it don't run with security, you will need to manually do stuff, which is a couple of commands to generate the certificates and configure everything correctly. But ideally, you can avoid that by just running it with security. And let's look at how that actually works, because I think it's quite cool in a distributed system how to make that work. Or let's start differently. In MySQL and Postgres, they were enforcing passwords for their services for a long time. Why is that so? Well, if you install MySQL on Ubuntu or whatever, it will always ask like provide a password, and then you need to provide the password. Why is that so much more complicated in Elasticsearch, or why didn't we do that for a long time? Yeah, it's because it's in a distributed system, it's much harder, because our point of view is like you need to have a proper certificate to actually secure that. And it shouldn't be one that is built in by default, that it's always the same, because others are doing that. That's again, it's pretty much like a default password. It's not adding much security. And then it's like the distribution of those credentials and passwords, which are quite painful in a distributed system. So let's see how that actually works. And I hope this actually runs. Sorry, not. This is what I need to start as well. Otherwise, this will fail. And now I'm very curious if my laptop still survives if I have Docker running, Zoom screen share, and recording with QuickTime. So this will, yeah, we will need to have some patience, I guess. We'll see in a moment. Yeah, probably it will start flying because it's an M1. So it's not the latest one, but it's one of the M1s at least. So what we're doing here is, and I'm just waiting for, okay, looks like Docker is up, so let's hope that this starts. I will just start running this and we can, oh no, I didn't clean up before, sorry. Give me 1 second, and there's a smarter way to do this, but I'm too lazy right now. Okay, so let me start this and hopefully it will start running. Yeah, it's definitely slower than normal. And while this is starting up, we can actually look at what I'm doing here. So we're doing Docker run on Elasticsearch to keep my machine more or less alive. I'm giving it just half a gig of heap. This is the Elasticsearch one node. I'm creating a network that is called Elastic, and on that all the Elastic components will be running. I publish the HTTP port on the default port on my host from the Docker image. And then I'm just using 8.2.2. So this will start this Elasticsearch node. And while I've been talking, hopefully the node has been starting up. And we're looking for one block in here that is standing out visually. And we keep scrolling down here. And somewhere you see this green stuff. The green stuff is the thing that you want. I'm using Docker here. If you do any other way of installation, it might look slightly different, but this is the general thing. So it has generated my password for the Elastic user, and this is the password, and I'll copy that because we'll need that in a moment, and we can just run curl. It is a self-signed certificate that we have generated. That's why I'm giving it the insecure flag, because this here is using HTTPS, but it's a self-signed certificate, so curl would complain that it's not a valid certificate. I'm logging in with the user Elastic, and now I'm pasting the password that we have just copied, and then it will tell me, okay, this is the cluster that or the node right now, one node cluster that we have started. So if I do cat nodes, and I paste the password again, it tells me this is my one node that we have been starting so far. Now, in that green thing, there are a lot of pieces of information. Kibana will keep for a little later, but Elasticsearch here has an enrollment token, and you can copy, paste this enrollment token, and we'll need that in a moment. By the way, this enrollment token for security reasons is also only valid for 30 minutes. If you need to enroll nodes later on, there's another command that you can run. So it's in the Docker container, you would need to run this binary, the Elasticsearch create enrollment token, that would spit you out a new token if your 30 minutes have expired. So if you scale up a cluster later on, you would need to generate a new token to enroll them. But since we are within the 30 minutes, and I don't intend to run longer here, we will be fine with that enrollment token. So I copied that enrollment token, and then I'm starting a second node where I have an old enrollment token pasted in, and we'll get rid of that first. Let me remove that. Yeah, it's a very long token, and that will be pretty secure. I don't think anybody will be able to break into that. Otherwise, it's doing exactly the same thing. Same heap configuration. This is just the Elasticsearch 2 node. So I can paste it in, and I have actually, this is the Elasticsearch 2 node that I wanted to use. So I'll paste in that token here. And this died because I've updated my command line. So we are starting the second node, and to speed this up, I'll do the same thing for the third node. So you can see this is all the same settings as before. This is just Elasticsearch 3. And ideally, if I don't run out of memory and if nothing else bad happens, these two nodes will in a moment join our cluster. So if I run the cat nodes and I need to paste the password from before to access that, this was faster than expected. You can see that already my 3 Elasticsearch nodes have formed a cluster. They are only communicating through TLS on transport and also on the HTTP port, and they have authentication enabled. Now, we also want to add Kibana. To add Kibana, I'm just doing Docker run on Kibana, exposing it on the default port again. How will I actually connect that to the cluster? For that, in that blob here, there is this other Kibana stack here. For Kibana, you need this enrollment token. So here, my Kibana is starting up, and it's actually running already. So let's see. Oops. This wants this enrollment token. So this is then securely connecting your Kibana instance to your Elasticsearch cluster. So we need to paste that Kibana enrollment token. And then it also goes kind of like the other way around as well, that in Kibana here, I need to copy this one-time passcode, that verification code. When I paste that in here, then the two are connected successfully. Now it's starting up. In a moment it's done. Now the two are connected and now I can actually log in. So what do I need to log in? Now I need my Elastic user and that password that we have copied from before. With that I can log in. And now you probably want to go to stack management. And here you have users and roles, and then you can actually create different users for different things that you want to have. So there are a couple of built-in users, but we could just create a new user with whatever password and the right permissions, either based on specific roles, or we could give it just permissions to a specific index, for example, based on what we configure in the role. So to make your stack more secure. The other thing that I think is a bit too little known or underused in stack management here, we also have API keys. Has anybody ever used API keys? Okay, 1, 2, 1.5. So we have API keys, and the nice thing about those is they can expire. So if you create a new API key, you can give it a name. You can say like, oh, it has global privileges, or it can be restricted. And they can also expire after a certain amount of time. So if you have some temporary functionality or you want to be sure that something expires after some time, you can just give people those API keys, and unlike users, they can expire if you want to. All of that is available for free, and please use it. Otherwise you might make the news, and we're always unhappy if people make the news because of us. But we are really trying to give you all the tools to make this easier. So the tooling can help like the operator, and we have kind of like built up over time to actually build in those features into the core products. And it's quite cool to have that in a distributed system that works on Windows, on Docker, if you use the Linux packages like a deb or RPM, like all those security features work across all of those, and just put the right stuff together to make your life easier, which I think is quite a cool thing. And ideally, we will have further down the line fewer reports of Elasticsearch instances that are being ransomed, because it's an unnecessary problem to have.
How will this integrate with the Zero Trust network?
How does it integrate with the Zero Trust network? I mean, so there is, for example, an integration in HashiCorp Vault, which is that what we're kind of like the direction where you're going, or what you're thinking about? Or
HashiCorp Vault is one of the solutions to
yeah.
create that. Also, for instance, the Cisco secure network.
Yeah, Cisco is probably too enterprisey for me, so I don't run into that so much. But I mean, in the end, anything that can run like something probably, or something, for example, to generate you an API key that is temporary, you want something like this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean.
And yeah, also certificate management. If you look at the Cisco network environment, they have their own tools for creating certificates.
Yes, I mean, then you cannot use default security anymore, because then you will need to provide like their own certificates that you bring into the system, and need to configure that. I think that the main problem there is that switching out certificates from a running node might not be that easy. I have not tried that out. The thing is, as long as you have some valid certificates, it's easy. The switch that is normally the hardest is going from no TLS certificates to TLS certificates, because that will, I think, need at least needs a full cluster restart. So that's not a rolling upgrade, but you need to actually add TLS, restart the cluster, and do that. Otherwise, you can probably roll out individual nodes if you rotate certificates. But that is so fun, I don't know. But with HashiCorp Vault and others, they will just generate I'm not sure if users or API keys, but they will generate short-lived credentials that you can just plug into the security system that Elastic provides.
Yeah, just be mindful, all the traditional ways of configuring security is still possible.
Yeah.
This is basically to make sure for those people that do not have advanced stuff or forget that they kind of are forced to actually do something. But all your traditional setups, if you want to make it really complex, there's a lot of documentation around that. Most of my customers tend to have such complex setups, but that's more on their end. And I've actually seen more cumbersome scenarios as well, where it's actually writing an ES. Particular certificate rotation was a recent example, where we rotate quite well, but the associated, let's call them other applications, did not. So you end up in mismatches and get a whole bunch of trap challenges. But that's on their ecosystem. I can't really speak for what they're doing with their ecosystem.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's documentation around all of this.
Yeah. It's just like these features were not built for the Vault users, etc. These were for the users who just bring up a cluster without thinking about anything and putting it on the internet, and then it's surprising like what big companies end up doing that. Yeah.
For which you could use OS query to actually try and find to see if that's happened. Just as a funny jump.
So is this a future part of 8.2 version?
No, this was all 8.0 already.
8.0.
So you can, that's been out since early February when 8.0 came out, so that's all built in. Like I think there were 1 or 2 small bugs in the very early versions, that like some information was not properly displayed or some things were not as smooth, but since 8.2 or so I think, or 8.1 even, we've ironed out most of those. And we've also, so since we have telemetry, we see the number of like clusters with and without security, and we've seen a considerable jump in clusters actually using security with 8.x versus previous versions. So it is working. It's just like we'll need to figure out, like we see that, for example, I think like short-lived clusters often disable security because people just use it for local testing or integration testing or whatever, and then don't bother or don't even want to have any TLS configured. So there they sometimes disable it, which we don't recommend, but especially for the longer running clusters, the ones that are either some staging or even production-like environment, their security is taking up quite well. And hopefully it stays that way.
Maybe an interesting note as well is that from our InfoSec team, we started to play a more active role, trying to reaching out for people who run in protected clusters on the open internet. So we've partially been successful on really like proactively warning users, customers on running non-secure Elasticsearch clusters.
You're hijacking their data and leaving it nice though. Elastic, we can do things for you.
I'm
So it's
sure
our
there's
way
people that
of-
would do that, but we're a bit more sensible that way.
Though I think it is sometimes very hard to actually figure out who the data belongs to, depending on if the cloud provider is cooperating and actually forwarding your messages. Because I think there were even like cases where a lot of data was lost or public, but nobody really knew who was the entity behind that. Even if all the data was stolen, it was kind of like hard to figure out with that. And obviously we cannot look at individual documents because we might run into personal data. And I mean, then you're already in potentially violation. So it's a very fine line that you need to walk carefully. And I wouldn't rely on it because I know that AWS has been doing that for a long time, that they continuously scan GitHub for somebody pushing their tokens accidentally. But then,
GitHub also does
yeah.
Does it now.
There are, I think they picked up on that and now it's better, but previously it was that AWS was scanning and then you just relied on who is faster. If AWS finds your token first and blocks it, or if somebody finds it first and then creates a bunch of other users with that token, and then your system is taken over. So don't wait for us to scan your cluster and tell you. On the other hand, there are often like these huge numbers of like, we found 10,000 clusters which are unprotected, and it's very hard to know which ones are honeypots or just test clusters with no real data. So it's like the quantity alone is a bit hard to justify how much sense that makes. Without downplaying it and without blaming users, because security is always a hard problem. But we are like I said, trying to make this easier, and everybody should hopefully avoid that problem going forward.
To be fair, your last statement is probably our biggest challenge in the industry right now. I was doing a meetup just last week and I had the same question from a couple of customers, like, how do I get people to do things secure? Teach them properly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is still happening a lot of people. And I wish everybody would have proper security classes, training. But yeah, it's still so easy to just do something function and go, yay, it works! And now it's broken. Okay.
Hopefully we'll get there. On the other hand, I think it's also kind of like almost a sign of success that it's always like Elasticsearch has been ransomed, and it shows like how many users and systems there are out there. You don't hear that about other systems, right? And they are not, I don't think so many other systems have that these security things in place for a distributed system. I couldn't name any others, to be honest, that have this fully automated setup for security. By the way, the one thing that is not adding TLS, because that would be an invalid certificate, it's very hard to see, but there is no TLS in Kibana here in the automated system, because that would be an invalid certificate. So only the communication within and to Elasticsearch uses TLS, but the communication to Kibana is not using a TLS certificate. You would need to manually add that yourself.
Can you generate a enrollment token from Kibana, like token that you are generating to add nodes?
For Elasticsearch to enroll further Elasticsearch, I do not think so.
No.
I have not seen that option before, to be honest. I only know how to do it on the command line. And that might also be like a security thing, that Kibana access alone is not enough to actually create those tokens, because that would need a very specific set of permissions otherwise to make sense, I think.
Does Kibana enrollment tokens also expire?
Yes, also 30 minutes. So if you're to wait somewhere here, I mean, it says it here, and then you need to regenerate those tokens actually.
That's a bit more annoying.
Yeah,
so I ran into it the other day. I wasn't aware, so I'd forgotten about it. And then it took me a couple of hours to actually get it done again. But yeah, that's because I'm not a pro.
Yeah, in theory, I think with the documentation, like it shouldn't be so hard to create the environment tokens, but yeah, you need to find the right command and the right place to run them and everything. So it's
That's the thing.
yeah. So bring up your cluster and be done with it. Or, as we obviously have to say, if that is too complicated, use cloud, because that does everything for you.
That was the mandatory shield statement, wasn't it?
I mean, to some degree, but I think it's also a very fair statement that if you cannot be bothered to set this up or get this up and running correctly, maybe you shouldn't run this yourself. I mean, better than making the news, but that's a different discussion afterwards. I still have to fill some time for the pizza to arrive, right? Because I think Adrian, who was sitting there, is downstairs to probably get the pizza. So it should be here any moment. You need to keep asking questions.
How technical do you want to go? What's encoded in enrollment token? Can we base 64?
Yeah, it looks very much base 64.
It's like the equal signs at the end of the
Yeah, I have not. Oops, that's the wrong.
We're going to screw with security now. Oh,
I mean, there must be a URL there, or an IP in there somewhere, right?
Now I need to come closer. Can you make the screen as
Yes,
big?
this now I need to. Okay, so it tells me the version, the address, and yeah, whatever those two things are.
Can you go to Kibana, because there were actually 2 API keys that had an expiry date that looked a lot like the expiry of your tokens.
Yeah, see, yeah, you're right. Those are the enrollment tokens.
Yeah, we probably can't see the key, only the.
Yeah, and those are expiring in 24 minutes.
So you've only got one or two components.
Yeah, from here. So it's basically the key is in there, probably some identification, and it uses the API system to make sure that they're only valid for 30 minutes. Okay, thank you.
And then you could potentially actually create it in Kibana. If you use the
can
right.
probably find all the other
Yeah.
keys that you
Yeah.
in the JSON block.
Yeah.
Because that once you're fully up and running, you can do pretty much everything.
Yeah.
That's critical. As long as you haven't used it as supervision, you could do and break any type of mechanism.
So with all the security enabled, would you recommend opening it up to like public internet and Elasticsearch?
I mean, if you don't have to, why?
Yes.
Why?
No, I'm just saying, how confident are you?
I mean, I think the enrollment tokens and the randomly generated passwords are very strong. I would be more concerned about, I don't know, a denial of service attack or something like that. It's just, it feels very unnecessary. I mean, it's part of like why our cloud service has like a, it's not hidden, but it has like the URL is also has a random part, or you can give it a custom name. So it's not easy to enumerate them, so nobody can just run a DOS against that. I mean, we also have IP filters on cloud, but generally,
one thing, like log4j somewhere.
Yeah.
It's still Java, it might have log4j somewhere.
yes.
Just don't do it public.
Yeah.
It's a database.
I mean, anything that you don't need to make public, don't do it. It's just giving you more surface. I don't think. Yeah. Did anybody have a lot of fun with Log4j?
I was on vacation.
Okay.
My colleagues had.
Because I know that we internally had a lot of fun, because I think it was like the Thursday night when it broke, and it was like mid-December or so, and everybody was done with the year. And I think then we were up to 100 people working on that, from the communication to like fixing stuff. I think we had a full rotation of support engineers just answering good and bad customer questions, figuring out if we had been affected anywhere ourselves. So it was like a full array of things that created fun stuff. And what saved Elasticsearch around Log4j?
The next day there was a customer ransomware.
No. So the thing that actually protected the Elasticsearch cluster was that we have the Java Security Manager. So and the Java Security Manager policy basically states what different packages in the code can do. And so what the actual exploit was that, or maybe I should take a step back. Everybody knows what Log4Shell or Log4j, the exploit was?
Yep.
So it was the thing where the logger was trying to do a lookup, and Java has this stupid system where it can do lookups against some values, and then it didn't just look up a value, but it would load code and execute that code. And that was basically, or that was a remote code execution. The thing was, because of the Java Security Manager, Elasticsearch basically didn't give the logger the permission to make any network calls. So you couldn't load any code. So it was not a remote code execution anymore. The worst thing and that was Java version dependent, that could happen in any recent version was DNS exfiltration of information, because it could still do DNS requests, but it couldn't receive data. So you could exfiltrate some information through DNS, but you couldn't call any or fetch any code, so it wasn't a remote code execution. Unless you were on 5.x, because that didn't have strict enough policies yet. But 6.x and 7.x didn't have a remote code execution. However, no security manager no security scanner understood that, because they just looked like, what are the dependencies that do you have in your lib folder? And they would always shout remote code execution. And then we had to explain for 20 minutes to somebody, no, it's not a remote code execution because of these things, and let me walk you through this, which was very annoying but we just had to update because it was a pointless fight against the security managers. And then I think Log4j had 4 vulnerabilities in total, whereas only the first one was really bad, and the other ones were kind of like not so important, but it caused a lot of confusion and discussions around it. And it was a great December and early January. And I spent a lot of time on that. And it actually, you can have a full matrix of which Elasticsearch version and which JDK version and how bad is the problem actually. So you can make a full table of how that looks like. Since we have time, and I don't.
The activity manager is going away, right?
The pizzas are there? Okay. Because I just wanted to show you the matrix that I've created of those. So it's.
I've abused your matrix quite a bit.
Yes. So this gives you the full list of, depending on what version you have and what JDK version you have, what can happen and what mitigations are in place. if you really want to know. And the Java Security Manager is going away. That is correct, because JDK internals. But we're working on other ways to hopefully have similar boundaries, because in the end, it doesn't make any sense. Why would your logger ever need to do a network call? It's just pointless, and it shouldn't be possible.
Useful ones.
Yeah, it was useful once for that exploit, but otherwise not so much. Okay, pizza? We can keep discussing over pizza. Thank you.